She had survived hostile takeovers, boardroom coups, and 2 assassination attempts disguised as accidents. But nothing in Lena Ashcroft's 30 years of life had prepared her for the sight of a restaurant cook. Flour still dusted on his forearms, apron half untied. Dismantle 6 armed men with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this before. Not as a last resort, not in desperation, as if violence, at some point in his life, had simply been Tuesday. She should have thanked him and walked away. Instead, she pulled out her phone and started digging. If this is your first time here, welcome. You found the right place. We tell stories that stay with you. Hit subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Tap like if you're already hooked. And drop a comment telling me your city and country. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one doesn't let go. The reservation had been Lena's idea, which meant it was also her mistake. Aurelius was the kind of restaurant that didn't put prices on the menu and kept its Michelin stars off the website, as if acknowledging them publicly would be too gauche. It occupied the top floor of a downtown Chicago building with floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides, which made it spectacular on clear nights and a navigational nightmare for the security detail, who preferred rooms with fewer sightlines and more walls. Lena's head of security, a blunt ex-Army Ranger named Dolan, had flagged it twice. She'd overruled him both times. "It's a dinner meeting, not a hostage negotiation," she'd told him that morning, already reading 2 emails simultaneously while her driver navigated morning traffic. "We're signing a partnership agreement with Brennan Tech. I need the atmosphere. Atmosphere closes deals." Dolan had said nothing, which was his particular brand of protest. The dinner started well. Marcus Brennan was in his late 50s, the kind of man who wore his money with deliberate carelessness. Slightly rumpled jacket, expensive watch he never glanced at. He laughed at the right moments and pushed back on 2 contract clauses with enough precision to signal he'd actually read the thing, which Lena respected. By the time the second course arrived, she was reasonably confident the deal would close before dessert. She noticed the men at 8:47 p.m. Not all at once. That was the thing that impressed her later, when she replayed it. She'd spotted the first one near the hostess stand. Dark jacket, too still, eyes doing a slow sweep of the room that had nothing to do with admiring the view. The second was 3 tables over, nursing a drink he hadn't touched. She'd clocked both of them as mild concerns, the background noise of being a target in a public space, and had kept talking to Brennan while quietly pressing the alert on the device in her jacket pocket. Dolan's voice came through the small earpiece 30 seconds later. "I see them. 4 more positioned near the service exit and the east stairwell. We count 6 total. Do not stand up." "I know," she said quietly, tilting her head as if responding to something Brennan had said. Brennan frowned. "I'm sorry?" "Nothing. I'm sorry. You were saying about the licensing terms." But Brennan had caught something in her expression. He was smart enough to stop talking and look around, and that was the moment everything came apart. The man near the hostess stand locked eyes with someone across the room and moved, and the careful staging collapsed into motion all at once. Lena stood up anyway, because sitting felt like surrender. What happened next she would later describe, in the privacy of her own thoughts, as the most disorienting 30 seconds of her life. And she had once watched a competitor try to stage a hostile takeover of her company live on financial television. The kitchen door opened. He came out holding a towel. That was the detail that stuck with her. The white towel, half tucked into the apron strings, the kind of absent-minded habit you develop when your hands need somewhere to go between tasks. He wasn't running. He wasn't shouting. He walked out of the kitchen and into the dining room at roughly the same pace he probably used to carry dishes. And for one surreal moment, Lena thought he was simply an oblivious cook who had terrible timing. Then the first attacker raised his arm. What happened after that was hard to follow in real time. Lena had seen trained fighters before. She employed several, and they moved with a certain visible physicality, a telegraphing of intention that made the violence legible even when it was fast. This was different. The cook moved through the space between himself and the attacker with almost no wasted motion, redirecting the raised arm with one hand while his elbow did something quick and decisive to the man's neck. The attacker went down before Lena fully registered he'd been touched. The second man came from the left. The cook didn't look. He stepped into the angle as if he'd already mapped it. One controlled movement, a shift of weight, a joint manipulation that bent the man's wrist in a direction it wasn't designed to go. There was a sound. The gun dropped. By the time Dolan and the security team were moving, it was largely over. 6 men. 30 seconds. Maybe less. The cook stood in the middle of the dining room, the white towel still half tucked into his apron strings, and looked around at what he'd done with an expression that wasn't satisfaction or adrenaline. It was something quieter and harder to name. He looked, Lena thought, like a man who had just done something he'd promised himself he wouldn't have to do again. Dolan reached him first, hand raised, ready to treat him as an additional threat until he assessed otherwise. "Easy," the cook said. His voice was flat, unremarkable. "I'm kitchen staff." "Name," Dolan said. "Mercer, Ethan Mercer." Dolan looked at Lena. Lena looked at Ethan Mercer. He was older than she'd initially registered, mid to late 30s, she guessed, with the kind of face that didn't advertise its age until you looked directly at it. There was a scar along his left jawline, faint and old, and his hands, now that she was looking at them, were disproportionately calloused for a restaurant cook. Not chef's calluses, different placement, different texture. His eyes were dark and very steady, the kind of steady that didn't come from calm temperament alone. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome," he said. And then, without waiting for anything further, he turned and walked back toward the kitchen. She didn't sleep that night. This wasn't unusual for Lena. She averaged 5 hours on a good week, her brain metabolizing anxiety into productivity with an efficiency. Her therapist called adaptive but unsustainable. But the insomnia that kept her at her home office desk until 3 a.m. wasn't the ordinary operational kind. It was a specific, focused sleeplessness aimed at one question she couldn't answer. Who was Ethan Mercer? She'd asked Dolan to run a preliminary background check before she left the scene. His report came back in 2 hours, and it was the thinness of it that bothered her more than anything. Birth record in Ohio, public school, a gap of almost a decade in his early 20s with nothing attached to it. No employment records, no residential history, no tax filings that she could find. Then a brief reemergence 4 years ago, a lease agreement in Wicker Park, Chicago. A registered vehicle. An 8-year-old son named Noah, enrolled at Hendricks Elementary. And a position as a line cook at Aurelius started 14 months ago. That was nearly it. For a 37-year-old man, the paper trail was laughably thin. "People don't become ghosts by accident," she said to no one, to the dark window and the city lights below. She opened a new browser window and started somewhere different. Not official records, but the kind of lateral digging that required patience and a willingness to follow threads that seemed unrelated. She had a contact at a private intelligence firm, a woman named Reeves, who owed her a favor from a corporate espionage case 2 years prior. Lena sent the message at 1:15 a.m. without apologizing for the hour. Reeves would understand. By morning, she had fragments. Not enough to form a complete picture, but enough to understand the shape of what she was looking at. A classified service record. She couldn't access the substance of it, but the classification itself was informative. The kind of classification that didn't get applied to administrative personnel. A commendation she couldn't read the details of. A medical discharge that Reeves described only as injury-related, circumstances redacted. And a death record. His wife. 4 years ago. Almost to the month he'd appeared in Chicago. Car accident. A woman named Claire Mercer, née Holt. 29 years old, survived by her husband and a 4-year-old son. Lena sat with that for a while. She thought about the way he'd walked back into the kitchen. No swagger, no backward glance. The quiet of a man who had done something he considered a private matter. She thought about a 4-year-old boy who had lost his mother and a man who had apparently dismantled an entire professional life and rebuilt it as anonymously as possible in a city where no one knew his name. She thought about how none of this answered the question that was actually keeping her awake, which was, what did Ethan Mercer know? And why had 6 men shown up at a restaurant where he worked? Because she had considered and rejected the possibility that this was a coincidence. She had been the target. She was confident of that. Aurelius had been on her public schedule for 3 days, but Mercer had responded to the attack with a speed and instinct that suggested prior knowledge of the threat, or something close to it. No civilian, even a highly trained former military operative, reacted that efficiently to a surprise ambush without some level of preparation. Unless he'd been watching, unless he'd been ready, unless he was already there for a reason that had nothing to do with the kitchen chat. She went to Aurelius at 11 a.m. before the lunch service. She told herself she was going to thank him properly, in a context where she could observe him without the noise of an active crisis. This was partially true. She was also going there because sitting in her office knowing what she knew about Ethan Mercer felt like an incomplete equation, and Lena Ashcroft had a constitutionally poor tolerance for incomplete equations. The restaurant's daytime face was unremarkable, deliveries coming in through the service entrance, a manager reviewing reservations at the front desk, the distant sound of prep work from the kitchen. She introduced herself to the manager, who was visibly nervous about having a billionaire CEO materialize in his lobby on a Tuesday morning, and asked to speak with Mercer. He came out 5 minutes later. He was in his kitchen whites, no apron, a cup of coffee he hadn't offered to put down. He looked at her with the same quality of stillness she'd noticed the night before, not wariness exactly. More like someone who had learned to be economical with his reactions because reactions cost something. "Ms. Ashcroft," he said. "Not what a surprise or I didn't expect to see you." Just her name, acknowledging the fact of her without any performance around it. Ethan. She'd decided to use his first name deliberately, to see how he responded to it. He didn't respond to it at all. "I wanted to thank you in person," she said. "Last night was... You acted very quickly. Seemed like the right thing to do." "It was. It also wasn't what most people would do." A pause. He drank his coffee. "Most people don't think about it the same way I do." "How do you think about it?" He looked at her steadily. "Like a problem that needs solving before it gets worse." She studied him for a moment. He was letting her look, which was its own kind of information. A man with something to hide generally worked harder to redirect attention. Or he was just genuinely unbothered, which was possible. Some people were, especially people who had lived through worse things than being observed by a tech executive. "Were you in the military?" she asked. His expression didn't shift. "I worked in the service industry for a while, different kind of service." It was a non-answer delivered with such complete neutrality that it almost functioned as an answer. She let it sit. "My security director wants to speak with you," she said, "about what you saw, the sequencing of events." "I figured." He set the coffee down on the edge of a nearby counter. "I can do that this afternoon, if that works." "This afternoon is fine." She turned to go, then stopped. It wasn't entirely calculated. Something about the quality of the pause felt genuine, even to her. "Your son," she said. "His name is Noah?" For the first time, something changed in his face. Not much. A very small recalibration around the eyes, some private calculation happening behind the stillness. "Yeah," he said. "How old?" 8. She nodded, as if this were simply polite small talk. "Good age. He's in school?" "Hendrix Elementary. He's got a science fair project due next week that's currently held together with Scotch tape and optimism." A faint, involuntary thing crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. It lasted about a second. "He's fine. Thanks for asking." She left without saying anything else, which was a choice. She didn't want to tip her hand before she understood more about what she was holding. What she found over the next 72 hours didn't make her feel safer. Reeves called on Wednesday afternoon with additional fragments. The classified service record had a unit designation buried in the metadata, not visible directly, but inferable from the file architecture. Tier 1. Special Operations. The kind of designation that didn't get handed out to people who hadn't done things that couldn't be discussed in unclassified settings. "How good?" Lena asked. "The kind of good where people who served with him don't talk about it even off the record," Reeves said. "I reached out to 2 former colleagues. Both declined immediately. One of them hung up when I said the name. That's either loyalty or fear. Could be both. Often is." Lena thought about this for a long time after she hung up. She thought about a man who had walked away from that world and into a kitchen, who was raising an 8-year-old boy alone in a Wicker Park apartment, who fixed science fair projects with Scotch tape. She thought about what a person gives up, and what they're running from, and whether those were the same thing. She also thought about the fact that someone inside her own company had known her schedule well enough to plan a 6-man ambush at a restaurant she'd confirmed 3 days in advance. That thought was colder and more urgent. She pulled up the internal calendar access logs for the past month and started reading. It was the kind of task she normally delegated, but she didn't trust delegation right now. Not until she knew whose hands she was delegating into. She made a coffee. She cleared her afternoon. By 9 p.m., she had a short list of 7 people with access to her detailed schedule. By 10 p.m., she had eliminated 3 based on access patterns and physical location data. By midnight, she had 2 she couldn't clear, and one of them made her stomach drop in a way she hadn't expected. Harrison Cole, Senior Vice President of Strategic Partnerships, 12 years with the company. The man who had personally managed 3 of her most sensitive defense technology contracts, and who she had, until approximately 4 hours ago, trusted almost without qualification. She sat in the dark with that for a while. Then she thought about Ethan Mercer sitting in a kitchen in Wicker Park, and a boy with a science fair project held together by tape and optimism, and she thought, whoever is coming for me already knows about him, and they don't know what he is. She picked up her phone. She didn't call Dolan, she called Mercer. He picked up on the second ring, which told her he'd been awake. I need to talk to you, she said. Not about last night, about what comes next. A silence on the other end. Then, how much do you already know? Enough to understand I don't know enough. Another silence, longer this time. My son goes to school at 8, he said. I can be somewhere at 8:30. I'll send you an address. She hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet of her office, looking at the city lights and thinking about the particular weight of a problem that has no clean edges. The kind you can't negotiate or acquire or outspend your way out of. The kind that requires something different, something she hadn't needed before and wasn't entirely sure she had. Outside, 30 floors down, the city moved and breathed and carried its ordinary secrets. Somewhere in Wicker Park, she imagined, a man was telling an 8-year-old boy to brush his teeth and go to sleep, and maybe looking out his own window at the same dark city with the same particular alertness. The kind that doesn't fully switch off, that stays even when you've tried everything to turn it down. She didn't know yet what they were walking into, but she was starting to understand that whatever it was, she wasn't going to be able to walk out of it alone. The address Lena sent was not her office and not her home. It was a private conference room on the 14th floor of a building she owned through a subsidiary, the kind of arrangement that didn't appear on any public filing and that her own legal team referred to as a discretionary asset. 3 years ago, she'd used it for a sensitive acquisition negotiation. Since then, it had sat empty, which was precisely why she chose it now. Ethan arrived at 8:33, 3 minutes late, which she noted without judgment. Dropping a child at school at 8 on a weekday involved variables outside anyone's control. He was in a dark jacket and jeans, no tie, the same kind of unremarkable presentation as before. He came in, looked around the room once with the practiced efficiency of a man assessing exits and sight lines, and sat down across the table from her without being invited to. "Nice room," he said. "You own this building?" "A company that I own owns it, yes." Layers. It's how things stay quiet. He nodded, as if this confirmed something he'd already suspected about her. He didn't have coffee. He'd declined the assistant's offer in the hallway, which she'd caught on the building's internal camera feed. She found herself cataloging these small details with an attention that felt almost involuntary. "You said you know enough to understand you don't know enough," he said, "so tell me what you've got." She laid it out cleanly and without embellishment. The classified service record, the unit designation Reeves had inferred, the former colleagues who wouldn't speak. She told him about the calendar access logs and the short list that had narrowed to 2 names and then, after a long night, to 1. She said Harrison Cole's name and watched Ethan's face. He didn't react the way she expected. He didn't tense or look away. He looked, if anything, slightly tired, the way a person looks when they've been carrying a weight for long enough that confirmation of the weight feels less like a shock and more like a door finally opening. "You already knew something about Cole," she said. It wasn't a question. "I knew something about someone. I didn't have a name." He shifted in his chair, not restlessly, but with the deliberateness of someone choosing how much to say. "I worked a short-term contract job about 6 weeks before I started at Aurelius. Security assessment for a defense logistics firm. During that job, I came across documentation that didn't belong to the firm I was assessing. It had been routed through their server architecture as a pass-through, someone using their infrastructure as a relay. What kind of documentation? Technical specifications. Encrypted, but the file structure was recognizable. The kind of thing that gets classified under export control laws. He paused. I didn't have enough to go to anyone with, and I had Noah to think about. So I noted it and walked away and told myself it was someone else's problem. The honesty of it, the plain admission of a choice he clearly hadn't been entirely comfortable with, landed differently than she expected. She'd assumed she'd be dealing with either deflection or a carefully managed disclosure. This was neither. And then 6 men showed up at a restaurant where you work, she said. And then 6 men showed up. He looked at the table for a moment. I don't think they were there for you. Or not only for you. I think someone found out I'd accessed those files and they're not sure exactly what I know, which means they're not sure whether to buy me off or just make me go away. They tried to make me go away first. You're higher profile, easier to make look like a random attack. Something shifted in his jaw. Taking out a line cook doesn't require the same staging. They were probably going to make it look like a mugging. She let that settle for a moment. So someone inside my company is running a side operation selling defense technology to parties who want it badly enough to commission violence, she said, and that someone has now identified you as a potential liability. That's roughly where I land, yeah. She leaned back slightly. I want to bring you inside the company, officially or officially enough. I need someone to audit our security infrastructure, and I need it done by someone who isn't already embedded in whatever this is. He looked at her for a long, flat moment. I'm a cook, he said. You're a former Tier 1 operator with a classified service record who has already demonstrated that you understand the technical landscape of what we're dealing with. She held his gaze. I'm not asking you to pretend you've been doing IT security. I'm asking you to do what you're already doing, but from the inside where you have access to the systems you need. And in return, consulting rate, $30,000 a month. He didn't blink, which told her the number wasn't the point. That's not what I'm asking. I know. She waited. He was quiet for a moment, and she had the sense of watching someone negotiate with themselves in real time. Not with her, not yet, but with some internal set of competing obligations that she wasn't privy to. Noah comes first, he said finally. Whatever I agree to, that's the condition. If something comes up with him, school, a doctor's appointment, he's sick, anything, I walk out of whatever room I'm in and I handle that first. No questions, no pushback. Agreed. And I report to you directly. Not Cole, not anyone in the executive layer until we know who's clean. Also agreed. I want the access logs going back 18 months. I'll have them on a secured drive for you by tomorrow. He was quiet again. Outside the building, 30 floors down, Chicago was already in full morning motion. The noise of it muffled but present through the glass, a low, continuous frequency like something breathing. I'll need 2 weeks to arrange coverage for Noah after school, he said. He stays with a neighbor sometimes, a woman named Mrs. Calloway, but I can't just drop an undefined commitment on her without notice. Take the time you need. He stood up. I'll need a different cover than consulting, something that explains access without raising flags with Cole's people. I was thinking corporate security review, new regulatory compliance initiative, boring enough that nobody looks twice. For the second time, something almost like a smile moved through his face without quite arriving. You're good at this. I've been underestimated by people with more resources than sense for 10 years, she said. You learn to think 3 moves out. He nodded once and picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. At the door he paused, hand on the frame, and she had the impression of a man doing one final internal calculation before committing. Ms. Ashcroft. Lena. A beat. Lena. If what you're suggesting is right, if Cole is actually running something like this through your infrastructure, this doesn't end with an HR conversation. I know. People who do what Cole apparently did don't go quietly when they feel cornered. I know that too. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully decode. Not concern, not quite. Something more like an honest assessment of whether she understood what she was agreeing to. Then he nodded again and left. She stayed in the room for another 10 minutes after the door closed, looking at nothing, thinking about everything. He started on a Monday, 11 days later. His official title was External Security Consultant, Classification Review, which was accurately bureaucratic and sufficiently dull to pass without scrutiny. Lena's chief of staff, a meticulous woman named Petra, who had been with her for 7 years and who Lena had quietly verified wasn't on the calendar access list, handled the paperwork. They gave Ethan a badge and a corner workspace on the 13th floor, separated from the main executive level by 2 floors and a keycard partition. The workspace mattered. She'd chosen it deliberately, close enough to the server architecture access points to justify his presence near the relevant systems, far enough from Cole's orbit that proximity wouldn't trigger instincts. Cole had a 6th-floor office with a view of the river and a team of 8 direct reports. Lena had watched him for the 11 days since her conversation with Ethan. He started on a Monday, 11 days later. His official title was External Security Consultant, Classification Review, which was accurately bureaucratic and sufficiently dull to pass without scrutiny. Lena's chief of staff, a meticulous woman named Petra, who had been with her for 7 years and who Lena had quietly verified wasn't on the calendar access list, handled the paperwork. They gave Ethan a badge and a corner workspace on the 13th floor, separated from the main executive level by 2 floors and a keycard partition. The workspace mattered. She'd chosen it deliberately, close enough to the server architecture access points to justify his presence near the relevant systems, far enough from Cole's orbit that proximity wouldn't trigger instincts. Cole had a 6th-floor office with a view of the river and a team of 8 direct reports. Lena had watched him for the 11 days since her conversation with Ethan, moving through their ordinary interactions with the careful normalcy of a person performing normalcy rather than living it. Cole was 51, silver-haired, the kind of corporate lifer who wore competence like a suit. It fit him well, and he'd had it tailored over many years. He smiled at the right moments. He asked the right questions in meetings. He had, for 12 years, been exactly what she'd thought he was. She had no idea when he'd stopped being that, or whether he ever had been. On Ethan's 3rd day, he came to her office at 7 p.m., after most of the floor had cleared out, and sat down across from her desk without the careful formality of their first meeting. He had a laptop and a legal pad with handwritten notes in a tight, economical script. "Talk to me," she said. "Your security architecture has a secondary data channel that's not in any of the documentation I was given." He turned the laptop so she could see the screen. "It runs parallel to your main server infrastructure, but it's routed through a third-party vendor relay, a logistics software company based out of Delaware called Meridian Bridge Solutions." "I know Meridian. They handle supply chain software for 3 of our subsidiary operations." "They do. But there's also a secondary channel piggybacking on that relationship that has nothing to do with supply chain software. Someone set it up approximately 14 months ago." He tapped the screen. "The traffic pattern is irregular. Not daily, not on any schedule I can predict. But when it does transmit, it's encrypted at a level that's significantly above what you'd need for normal business data." 14 months ago. She ran the calendar backward in her head. "That's about 2 months after we finalized the Cassian contract." He looked at her steadily. "What's the Cassian contract?" She was quiet for a moment, feeling the weight of what she was about to say. The Cassian contract was not something she discussed outside of a very small room. It represented 48 months of development work, a significant portion of her company's defense technology portfolio, and the kind of classified specifications that did not belong in anyone's hands without the requisite government clearances. "Proprietary positioning and targeting software," she said carefully. "We developed it under a DoD contract. It's not a weapon, but in the wrong hands it enables very precise weapon deployment, the kind of precision that changes the math on certain kinds of conflict." Ethan looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way someone does when they're trying to be careful with their reaction. Then he looked back at her. "And Cole was the executive lead on that contract." "Strategic partnerships, yes. He managed the relationship with the DoD procurement office and had access to the full technical specifications." She heard her own voice coming out very flat and controlled, which was how her voice went when she was managing something that, in a different context, might become something louder. "He had access because I gave it to him." "You couldn't have known." "No," she said, "but I should have structured it so that knowing wasn't necessary." She pulled the laptop toward her and looked at the data channel Ethan had mapped. "Can you trace where it terminates?" "I've been working on that. The relay at Meridian Bridge is intentionally convoluted. It's been built to resist exactly this kind of forensic mapping. But I found 2 nodes so far, and neither of them is a legitimate business entity." He paused. One of them resolves to a financial services shell in Luxembourg. The other goes dark. I haven't been able to trace it further yet, but the traffic volume on the dark node has been increasing over the last 6 weeks. Since the restaurant, she said. Since the restaurant. Yeah. He closed the laptop. Whatever they're moving, they're accelerating the timeline. That usually means something changed. Either they think they're about to be exposed, or they're approaching a delivery deadline. Or both. Or both. She stood up and went to the window. The Chicago River caught the evening light and threw it back in pieces, fragmented and restless. She thought about the cash-in specifications sitting somewhere in an encrypted package in a Luxembourg shell, or wherever the dark node led, the product of years of engineering work and the trust of a government contract, being sold to people whose intentions she couldn't verify and whose use of the technology she could not predict. I need to know who's at the other end of that channel, she said. I know. I'm working on it. He was quiet for a moment. There's something else. She turned. The access logs you gave me, the 18 months of calendar and system access. He didn't look away from her. Cole isn't the only flag. She felt something cold settle in her chest. How many? 2 other names show irregular access patterns, not at Cole's level. I think they're facilitators rather than principals. But they've been moving information in smaller pieces in ways that are designed to look like normal workflow. He picked up the legal pad. Your head of engineering compliance, a man named Stokes, and a contract data analyst who's been with you for 8 months through a staffing firm. Her name is Yolanda Pratt. She knew Stokes well, had promoted him 2 years ago. The information sat in her stomach like something she'd swallowed wrong. Are you certain? Certain enough that I wouldn't be telling you if I wasn't. He set the legal pad down. I'm sorry. I know this isn't what you were hoping for. I wasn't hoping for anything, she said. I was preparing for what I'd find. She turned back to the window. That's not the same thing. Well, the following week was the hardest kind of professional performance, maintaining absolute normalcy with 3 people who might be actively working against her, while simultaneously building a case that could withstand the scrutiny it would eventually face. She sat in meetings with Cole and nodded at his analysis and let him explain his strategic vision for the next fiscal quarter, and she kept her face in a register she'd learned to maintain under pressure over many years. Attentive, considered, faintly warm. She was good at it. She hated that she was good at it. Ethan worked from the 13th floor and sent her encrypted summaries at the end of each day through a messaging channel he'd set up outside the company's internal infrastructure. He wrote in a spare, precise style. No more words than the information required. No editorializing. She found herself looking forward to those messages with an intensity she didn't entirely examine. It was partly the relief of one honest channel in a building that had started to feel like a performance. It was partly something else she kept in her peripheral vision without looking at directly. On Thursday of that week, he texted her at 3:47 p.m. from a number she recognized. Not the encrypted channel, his personal phone. The message read, Noah's science fair thing is tonight. He got second place. He's devastated in that specific way. An 8-year-old is devastated when second place feels like the end of the world. She stared at the message for a long moment, aware that it wasn't the kind of communication she'd expected and uncertain what to do with it. She typed back, what was the project? A minute later, density and buoyancy. He built a thing that demonstrates why some objects float and some don't. The kid who won did something with volcanoes. Noah said, and I quote, volcanoes are not even science, they're just fire. She laughed. Actually laughed. A short, involuntary sound in an empty office. She typed, second place is legitimate, first place is politics. His response came back after a moment. I'll use that. He'll appreciate the cynicism. She set the phone down and sat for a minute with the strange warmth of that small exchange, which felt like a window into a life being lived at a different altitude than her own. Closer to the ground, more specific, more honest about what mattered. A boy with a density project and a father who texted a billionaire about second place because she suspected he didn't have many people to tell. She thought about what she was asking him to walk back into and felt, for the first time in the week since she'd seen his face when she mentioned Noah's name, something that might have been guilt. It was Ethan who found the delivery date. He came to her office on Friday morning earlier than usual. She was still on her first coffee, and Petra hadn't arrived yet, which meant he'd timed it deliberately. 11 days, he said. She put the coffee down. Tell me. The dark node. I tracked it through a secondary relay I found yesterday. It terminates at a financial structure connected to a procurement entity operating out of Eastern Europe, which is itself a front for a larger organization that Interpol has flagged twice in the last 3 years under different names. He spread 3 printed pages across her desk. They're not a state actor, they're a private broker. They acquire technology and resell it to whoever's buying. The Cassian specifications are apparently a priority acquisition. There's a handoff scheduled in 11 days. Where? I haven't been able to pinpoint the location yet, but the communications pattern suggests it's going to happen domestically, likely a transfer at a neutral commercial site. They're keeping the logistics off the primary channel, which means someone will be running the physical handoff personally. She looked at the pages. Cole. Most likely. He has a scheduled business trip to Philadelphia next week. 2 nights, ostensibly for a partnership meeting. He tapped one of the pages. The partnership meeting is real, but I think it's cover. I think the actual handoff happens in the margins of the trip, somewhere between the hotel and the meeting venue. She sat back. We need to loop in the FBI. Yes. If we do that, we lose control of the timeline and the approach. Yes. He looked at her steadily. But if we don't and something goes wrong, the Cassian specifications reach the open market and we're both facing federal charges for sitting on it. She knew he was right. She'd known it all week, the way you know something you're not quite ready to say out loud. I have a contact at the bureau, she said, someone I trust. She's in white-collar crime, but she has relationships in the counterintelligence division. I can make a call today. Do it carefully. Cole doesn't know yet that I found the channel. If word gets to him through the wrong pathway before we have enough to move on, he burns everything and disappears. I know how to be careful. He started gathering the pages. There's one other thing. He didn't look up immediately, and she noticed that the tell of someone choosing their timing. The crime organization that's buying the Cassian specs, based on what I've been able to pull together on their operational profile, they're not squeamish about removing obstacles. Neither am I. I'm not worried about you, he said, and looked up then. They know about me, Lena. They've known since the restaurant that something went wrong with their operation, and they've been trying to figure out where the exposure is. It's only a matter of time before they connect the dots between the restaurant and my name and the fact that I'm now inside your building. The room was quiet. If they think I know enough to bury this, he said, they won't just come at me professionally. They'll use what's close to me. His jaw moved almost imperceptibly. And what's closest to me is 8 years old and has a science fair project held together with Scotch tape. She held his gaze and understood what he was actually saying. Not a request for reassurance, not a performance of fear. A man telling her the specific concrete shape of what he had at stake. Telling her clearly, so there was no ambiguity between them about what this meant. I'll increase the security on Hendricks Elementary, she said quietly. Discreetly. Petra knows someone. Private, vetted, no paper trail to the company. He nodded. Something shifted in his shoulders, barely visible, the way someone unconsciously carries less weight when a decision gets made. 11 days, he said. 11 days, she agreed. He left. She picked up her phone and looked at the screen for a moment, at the thread with his personal number and the exchange about a boy who thought volcanoes were not even science. Then she opened a different contact and dialed her FBI connection, and the careful, dangerous work of the next 11 days began. The FBI contact's name was Special Agent Dana Rice, and she arrived at the subsidiary building on a Wednesday morning in a car that looked like a rental and clothes that looked like she'd bought them specifically to look like she hadn't thought about what she was wearing. She was in her mid-40s, sharp-faced, the kind of woman who had spent enough years in rooms where people lied to her that she'd developed a permanent slight squint, as if perpetually deciding how much of what she was hearing to believe. Ethan sat in on the meeting because Lena had asked him to, and because the information he'd assembled was more legible coming directly from him than filtered through her. He laid it out the same way he'd laid it out for Lena. Clean, sequenced, no editorializing. The secondary data channel. The Meridian Bridge Relay. The Luxembourg Shell and the dark node resolving to the Eastern European procurement front. The 11-day timeline and Cole's Philadelphia trip sitting in the middle of it. Rice listened without interrupting. She took notes by hand, which Lena had noticed federal agents of a certain generation still preferred. When Ethan finished, she looked at the pages he'd printed, then looked at him. "You got all of this through standard access log review," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Corporate security audit," Ethan said. "My access was authorized." "I'm not questioning your access. I'm noting that this is thorough for 14 days of work." "I had good material to work with." Rice looked at him for a moment with the squint at full deployment, then made a note. "We'll need to run parallel verification before we can move on Cole. That takes time." "How much time?" Lena asked. "Standard process? 4 to 6 weeks minimum for a case this sensitive. We'd need warrants, surveillance authorization." "You have 11 days, Ethan said. "That's not how federal investigations—" "I understand how federal investigations work," he said. Not sharply, just directly, with the particular firmness of a man who has sat in enough classified briefings to know exactly how institutional timelines expand when nobody is pushing from the outside. "I'm telling you that in 11 days, Harrison Cole gets on a train to Philadelphia, and somewhere between Union Station and his hotel, the cash-in specifications move from your jurisdiction to someone else's infrastructure. After that, you're doing international coordination with 3 governments to recover something that should never have left this building." Rice set her pen down. She looked at Lena. "Is he always like this?" "I genuinely don't know him well enough to answer that," Lena said. Something shifted in Rice's expression. Not quite amusement, but close. "I'll make calls today. I can get expedited authorization if the counterintelligence angle is as solid as what you've shown me. But I need everything you have on the Eastern European entity. Every node, every relay, every file path." "It's on the drive," Ethan said, and slid a small encrypted device across the table. Rice picked it up and looked at it. "And the surveillance on Cole stays passive until I authorize an escalation. Nobody moves on him. Nobody tips him. If he gets spooked and burns the channel, we lose the evidentiary chain and probably lose him too." "Understood," Lena said. "That means you keep showing up to meetings with this man and acting like everything is normal." "I've been doing that for 2 weeks." "I know. I'm telling you, it has to hold for at least 7 more days." Rice stood and picked up her notes and the drive. At the door she paused, which seemed to be something people did in that room. "Ms. Ashcroft, you should know. If this goes where the evidence suggests, the exposure for your company is significant. Defense technology breach of this nature means congressional notification, DoD review, potential contract suspension." "I know. Your legal team needs to be looped in." "My legal team will be the second call I make today. You're the first." Rice looked at her for a moment. "Good." Then she left. The room settled into the particular quiet that follows a high-stakes conversation. The kind of quiet that has texture, that presses slightly. 7 more days of normal," Ethan said. "Yes," he exhaled. "Cole's going to start feeling the pressure. People running operations like this always do. They develop a sensitivity to disruption in their environment right before a handoff. He's going to be watching the people around him more carefully. Then I'll give him less to see." "You're good at that." She looked at him. He was staring at the table, not at her, and there was something in his posture, a very slight forward lean, the attitude of a man thinking past the current problem to the shape of the next one. She'd noticed that about him over the 2 weeks he'd been in the building. He was always one step ahead in his thinking, but he wore it quietly, without the performative certainty she was used to from men in high-stakes rooms. "How's Noah?" she asked. He looked up, surprised by the shift. "He's fine. He's moved on from the science fair, currently obsessed with a book about deep-sea creatures. He told me last night that the anglerfish is the most honest animal in the ocean because it uses a light to attract things and then eats them." A brief pause. "He said that's what business people do." She laughed and meant it. "He's not wrong." "He's 8, Ethan said. "He shouldn't know that yet." The next 6 days passed in the specific way that high-pressure waiting passes, not slowly, but with an uneven texture, some hours dense and some strangely light. Reese came back on day 4 with confirmation that the Counterintelligence Division had authorized expedited action. Surveillance on Cole began. Warrants were in process. The Philadelphia intercept was being built. Ethan kept working from the 13th floor, mapping the secondary channel's remaining architecture and building a documentation package that could survive legal scrutiny. He was meticulous in a way she found both reassuring and slightly exhausting. He checked things twice without appearing to check them at all, and he had a habit of going quiet in the middle of a conversation while he worked through something internally, then surfacing with an observation that reframed everything she'd just said. She started bringing 2 coffees when she went to his workspace. He noticed and didn't comment on it, which was exactly the right response. On day 6, he sent an encrypted message at 9 p.m. Channel traffic spiked tonight. Something changed on their end. Could be routine pre-handoff activity. Could be they detected the surveillance. Watch Cole tomorrow morning. She watched Cole tomorrow morning. He arrived 20 minutes earlier than usual, which he did occasionally, and spent the first hour in his office with the door closed, which he also did occasionally. But there was something in the way he moved through the hallway afterward, a quality of attention that was slightly elevated, a scanning of peripheral space that she recognized because Ethan did it too, and it meant something different when she saw it in Cole. She messaged Rice immediately. Rice messaged back 40 minutes later. We see it. Surveillance is tight. Don't change anything on your end. She didn't change anything. She went to her 10 a.m. meeting and her 11:30 call and her working lunch with the product team and smiled at the right moments and asked the right questions and did not look at Harrison Cole. The way you look at a man you now understood had been selling pieces of her life's work to people who wanted to use it to make certain kinds of violence more precise. It was day 8 when everything changed, and it didn't change at the office. Ethan's call came in at 3:22 p.m. She was in a meeting and she stepped out because she'd told Petra weeks ago that his calls always got answered. And when she put the phone to her ear, she knew immediately from the quality of his silence, the 2 seconds before he spoke, that something had gone wrong. Noah didn't come out of school, he said. The words were level, controlled in the way that things get controlled when the person speaking them is using every available resource to stay functional. What do you mean? I was there at pickup, 3:10. He didn't come out with his class. I went inside, but his teacher thought he'd already left. Security footage at the side gate shows a gray panel van. 2 men. He got in the van at 3:04. His voice was doing something complicated beneath the surface, staying flat on top while something else entirely moved underneath. He's 6 minutes gone by the time I knew. She was already moving out of the conference room, down the hallway, signaling to Petra with one hand. Are you at the school? I'm in my car outside. I'm deciding what to do. Call Rice. Right now. I know. A pause. I know I need to call Rice. I'm calling you first because... He stopped, started again. Because I needed a minute where I'm just his father and not someone making operational decisions. She stopped walking. She stood in the corridor outside the conference room and understood what he was handing her in that sentence, and she held it carefully. Okay, she said. Take the minute. He was quiet for 4 or 5 seconds. She didn't fill it. Okay, he said. I'm calling Rice. I'm coming to you. You don't need to. I'm coming, she said, and ended the call. He said. Rice had a team at Hendricks Elementary within 22 minutes, which was fast by most measures and felt catastrophically slow by the only measure that mattered. Ethan was standing in the school parking lot when Lena arrived, in the particular stillness she'd seen in him at Aurelius. The same quality, but different underneath. At the restaurant, it had been the stillness of competence. This was the stillness of a man holding himself together around something that wanted to come apart. She stood next to him without touching him, and without saying anything that required a response. After a moment, he said, The van had a partial plate, Illinois registration. Rice has it. Good. They took him because they want the documentation I built. They think I'll trade it. He said this in a flat, analytical tone, as if he were briefing someone, as if the distance of briefing language was the only way to move through the next few minutes. They're wrong about the trade, but they're right that it gives them leverage. They can't know how much leverage. He turned and looked at her for the first time since she'd arrived. His eyes were very dark in the afternoon light. I'm not surrendering anything, not the documentation, not the case against Cole. If I do, those specifications reach the market and nobody gets Noah back because nobody who operates the way these people operate leaves loose ends. I know. I need you to know that going in, because what I'm about to do is not going to look like cooperation with the FBI's timeline. Rice appeared from inside the school building, tablet in hand, talking to someone on her earpiece. She reached them and looked at Ethan directly. "We have a hit on the partial plate," she said. "Vehicle is registered to a shell company with the same Luxembourg structure you identified. It was spotted on 2 cameras heading south on Halstead. We're running the feed forward now." She paused. "Mr. Mercer, I need you to let my team handle this. I know you do. I'm serious. You go operational on your own right now and you compromise everything. I know." He looked at her steadily. "And I'm telling you I'll stay in contact and share everything I develop. But I'm not standing in a parking lot while your team runs plate data." Rice held his gaze for a moment. She was not a woman who backed down easily. Lena had read that in her the first morning. But she was also a woman smart enough to recognize when a negotiation had already concluded. "You check in every 30 minutes, Rice said. "You share location. You do not engage without authorization." "Understood." Rice looked at Lena. "That goes for you too." "I'm a technology CEO, Lena said. "What would I do?" Rice's expression made clear exactly what she thought of that answer. Then she turned back to her team. Ethan was already moving toward his car. Lena fell into step beside him. "You're not coming," he said. "I'm not asking permission." He stopped and looked at her. There was something in his face, not the operational flatness of the last 20 minutes. Something more honest than that, and more complicated. "Lena, what's out there isn't a boardroom. I know what's out there." She held his gaze. "And I know that you're about to do something that requires someone watching your back who isn't wearing a federal badge. Someone who can move without a chain of command." She paused. "And I know that right now you're running on about 40% functional because the other 60% is sitting in the back of a gray van." She said it simply, without cruelty. "You need someone thinking clearly next to you." He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light was going flat and gray, the way Chicago afternoons did in the shoulder season, losing warmth gradually and then all at once. "Get in the car," he said. He drove south on Halstead, and she navigated from the passenger seat using a real-time traffic monitoring app that her company's engineering team had built for logistics optimization, and that turned out to be remarkably useful for tracking camera dead zones along a corridor. "There," she said, pointing at the screen. "Camera gap between Pershing and 43rd, 3 blocks with no city coverage. If they were trying to transfer him to a secondary vehicle, that's where." He glanced at the screen without slowing down. "There are 4 industrial properties in that gap. You have satellite access?" She was already pulling it up on her tablet, routed through her company's internal mapping infrastructure. 2 of them are active. One's a cold storage facility, one's a paper supplier. The other 2 are vacant. She zoomed in. This one, Cortland Fabrications. City permit records show it's been in receivership for 11 months, but the power draw on the municipal grid is inconsistent with a vacant building. He turned the car without speaking. She messaged Rice, "Cortland Fabrications, 3900 block South Halstead, possible secondary site, power anomaly on city grid for vacant building, check it." Reese came back in 4 minutes. "We see it. Team is 12 minutes out. Do not approach." She showed Ethan the message. He read it and kept driving. "You're not stopping," she said. "Noah has been in that building, or wherever they're taking him, for 40 minutes. His voice was very quiet. "I'm not waiting 12 minutes in a car 2 blocks away." She looked at the map, then at him. "How do you want to do this?" "I go in quiet. No confrontation until I have eyes on him. You stay at the perimeter and relay to Reese." "I can do more than relay." "I know. But if you're inside and something goes wrong, I'm splitting attention between the problem and keeping you alive, and I can't afford that right now." He said it without apology, just the math of it. "Stay on comms. If I stop transmitting, send everything to Rice immediately. And if you find him, then I'll find him." Something moved in his jaw. "And I'll bring him out." He parked on a side street a block and a half from the building, and they sat for 30 seconds while he did something internal that she didn't interrupt. He checked the small concealed firearm at his hip. She'd known it was there from day 3 and had never mentioned it. And then he looked at her one time with an expression that had several things in it she didn't try to fully catalog. "Stay on the line," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." He got out of the car. She watched him move down the block, and then she turned to the tablet and to the open call with Rice, and did what she'd said she would do, which was think clearly, which was the specific thing that fear was trying to prevent. She cataloged the building's external access points from the satellite image. She noted the positions of two vehicles parked outside that didn't match the industrial neighborhood context. Too clean, too carefully placed. She relayed all of it to Rice in precise, factual sentences. Rice said, "Your team is 8 minutes out. Keep him on comms." "I'm trying." Ethan's voice came through the earpiece quietly. "I'm at the East Service entrance. One guard, exterior. Taking him out of the equation." A sound, brief and conclusive. "East entrance is clear," Ethan said. "Going in." She gripped the tablet and watched the satellite image, and thought about an 8-year-old boy who believed the anglerfish was the most honest animal in the ocean. She thought about Scotch tape and science fair projects, and the very specific way Ethan's face had changed when she'd first said Noah's name, weeks ago in a restaurant, a small, involuntary softening that she'd stored without meaning to, and that had sat in her memory ever since. "I have eyes on a back room," Ethan said. "2 guards inside the main floor, 3 more at the stairwell." A pause. "There's a sound from above, 2nd floor." "Noah?" "Can't confirm. I'm going up the exterior fire escape." She closed her eyes for 2 seconds, then opened them and relayed to Rice. Then she got out of the car. She told herself it was a tactical decision. Better to be at the perimeter than in it. Better to have eyes on the building exterior than be blind in a parked vehicle. She told herself this was reasonable, and that she was thinking clearly, which she had promised to do. She walked along the building's south face, staying in the shadow of a rusted fence line, tablet tucked under her arm. She heard Ethan's voice again, lower now, nearly a murmur. "2nd floor. I see him." Her hand tightened on the tablet. "He's—" A pause. Something in Ethan's voice changed, very slightly. Not relief. Something more complicated, more fragile. "He's sitting in a corner. He's got something in his hand. I think he's writing." She stopped walking, writing. "Is he hurt?" "I can't see clearly. He's—" Another pause. "He's been tearing pieces off his shoe insole. He's been leaving marks on the floor, arrows." Ethan's voice was doing the thing again, the controlled surface with the complicated movement underneath. "He's been leaving a trail. He figured someone would come looking, and he's been leaving a trail." She stood in the shadow of the fence and felt something move through her chest that she didn't have a ready category for. Not sentiment. Something harder than that. Something that had an edge. The image of an 8-year-old boy in an unfamiliar, frightening room, deciding that the best use of his fear was to turn it into information. "He's your son," she said quietly, meaning it as observation, not compliment. Ethan didn't respond immediately. When he spoke again, his voice had the same flatness as before, but with something underneath it that had changed. A quality she associated with people who have just been reminded of exactly what they are fighting for, not abstractly, but specifically, in a form that weighs something and breathes. "Federal team is going to be here in 4 minutes, he said. "I'm going in." "Ethan, I'll be out before they arrive." A beat. "With him." She heard him move through the earpiece, controlled, deliberate, the specific quality of silence that surrounds a person who knows how to carry their weight so it doesn't make sound. She stood at this perimeter in the fading afternoon light and watched the building and kept the line to Rice open and thought, 4 minutes is a very long time in certain kinds of silence, and a very short time in others, and there is no way to know in advance which kind you're living through until it's already over. She heard a sound from inside the building, then another, then nothing for a long 30 seconds that she counted without meaning to. Then Ethan's voice in her ear, so quiet she almost missed it. "We're coming out the east entrance," he said. "He's with me. He's okay." She exhaled. It came out unsteady, which she hadn't expected, and she stood in the shadow of the rusted fence for a moment, and let herself be unsteady because there was nobody watching and because some responses were appropriate. Then she walked toward the east entrance. They came out together, Ethan with one hand on Noah's shoulder, the boy slightly rumpled and pale but walking on his own, a small torn piece of insole still clenched in one hand, as if he hadn't quite finished his work yet. Noah looked up and saw Lena standing at the edge of the lot and stopped. "You're the CEO lady," he said. "I am," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the frank, unfiltered assessment that children do better than adults. "My dad said you were smart." She glanced at Ethan. He was looking at his son with an expression she would think about later, in the quiet of her own apartment, for longer than she would admit to anyone. It was the expression of a man who has had something returned to him that he was not certain he could survive losing. "Your dad was being generous," she said to Noah. "He's not usually generous," Noah said. "He's usually just accurate." Behind her, she could hear the first federal vehicles arriving, the organized sound of a response team doing what response teams do. Reese's voice came through the earpiece with clipped, efficient instructions. The building would be secured. Cole's people were already inside and about to be considerably less free than they'd been 4 minutes ago. All of that was happening, and it mattered, and it was the reason they were here. But in this specific moment, in the shadow of a defunct fabrication building on the south side of Chicago, with federal agents moving in formation 50 yards away, what she was looking at was a father and an 8-year-old boy standing together in the fading gray afternoon light, and the boy still had pieces of his shoe insole in his hand, and neither of them had let go of the other since they'd walked through the door. Rice appeared at her shoulder. "Building is secure. We have 4 individuals in custody, 2 more fled on foot. Pursuit is active." She looked at Noah, and something shifted briefly in her professional composure. "Kid okay?" "He left markers," Lena said. "Inside the building, torn insole, arrows on the floor. He was giving us a trail." Rice looked at Noah for a moment. "Smart kid." Noah, who had been listening, said, "I read a book about explorers. They always leave markers." Rice made a sound that might have been the early stages of a laugh, quickly managed. She turned back to the building and her team and the extensive operational work that still needed doing. Lena stood where she was. Ethan looked up and met her eyes over the top of Noah's head. He didn't say anything, but the look had something in it, an acknowledgement, specific and genuine, of the fact that she was here, in this parking lot, in this city's gray afternoon light, when she absolutely did not have to be. She held the look for a moment, then looked away. Somewhere to the north, Harrison Cole was still in his office, 35 floors up, watching the river and not yet knowing that the fabrication building on the south side was crawling with federal agents, and that the 11-day timeline had just collapsed into something considerably more immediate. That part still needed handling, but it could wait 20 minutes. Rice's team had 4 people in custody from the fabrication building, and 2 more picked up 6 blocks away, still running, which Rice noted with the dry satisfaction of someone who had watched a lot of people underestimate how many agents were covering a perimeter. But the names they gave, under the particular pressure of federal questioning, were operational, hired hands, not architects. Nobody in that building knew where Harrison Cole was in the chain above them. They knew a contact number that had already gone dead by the time forensics pulled it from the first man's phone. Cole had been warned. Ethan figured this out in the car on the way back, with Noah asleep against his shoulder in the back seat and Lena driving because he'd handed her the keys without discussion and she'd taken them the same way. The math wasn't complicated. The fabrication building operation had failed, and whoever Cole was reporting to would have known within minutes, which meant Cole knew. Which meant the Philadelphia trip, timeline, was already being burned. He messaged Rice from the back seat, one-handed, trying not to wake Noah. "Cole's been tipped. He's moving the timeline up or pulling out entirely. You need to be on him tonight." Rice came back in under 3 minutes. Surveillance confirmed movement. He left the building at 5:47. Currently heading toward the lakefront. "Team is on him. Stay put." He looked at Stay Put for a moment. Then he looked at Noah, who had his cheek against Ethan's jacket and was breathing the deep, uncomplicated way children breathe when they've exhausted their fear, and their body has simply shut down the parts that aren't necessary. He still had the torn piece of insole in his closed fist. He hadn't let go of it the entire ride. Ethan looked out the window at the city moving past in the dark and felt the competing pull of 2 things that were both real and both urgent, and that had been in conflict since the moment he'd taken this job. Except that now the conflict had a face and a weight and was asleep against his arm. He stayed put. They got Noah to Mrs. Calloway's apartment, a 3rd-floor walk-up in Wicker Park, where the neighbor opened the door in a bathrobe and took one look at all 3 of them and said nothing except "Come in, and I'll make tea," which was the correct response and which Ethan appreciated more than he could have explained. Noah woke up enough to walk inside and immediately fell back asleep on the couch under a quilt Mrs. Calloway produced from a closet, still holding the insole piece. Ethan stood in the hallway outside the apartment and looked at the closed door for a moment. Lena stood beside him. "He's safe," she said. "He's safe right now." Ethan said. Cole is still out there. Whoever is above Cole is still out there. Safe right now is not the same as safe. I know. He turned to look at her. She'd been driving for 40 minutes and managing Rice on comms simultaneously, and at some point in all of that, she'd lost whatever executive composure she usually maintained as a kind of professional weather system around herself. She looked tired. She looked like a person, which was different from how she usually looked, and he wasn't sure what to do with the difference. You should go home, he said. Rice is going to call with Cole's location. She'll call me. She'll call both of us. Lena leaned against the hallway wall and folded her arms. I'm not going home, Ethan, so we can either stand here arguing about it or we can figure out what Cole does next. He looked at her for another moment, then looked away. He doesn't run, he said. That's my read. He's been building this for over a year. He's got a buyer with a hard deadline, and the people above him are not the kind of organization that accepts refunds. If he runs without delivering, he's more exposed than if he tries to complete the handoff through a different channel. He leaned against the opposite wall. He needs the Cassian files. He has them on a secured drive somewhere, not on the company servers. He'd have pulled a clean copy months ago and kept it off the main infrastructure. He needs to deliver that drive to the buyer before the FBI closes the net. So he needs a new location, somewhere the surveillance team hasn't mapped, somewhere he has control of, somewhere isolated enough that he can manage a handoff without witnesses, he thought. He's been operating in this city for 12 years. He knows it. He has something, a property, a contact, a location he's kept off everything. He pushed off the wall. I need to go back through the access logs. The Meridian Bridge relay. There were traffic spikes I didn't fully trace because I was focused on the Eastern European node. One of those spikes might show a domestic endpoint. Your laptop's in my car. I know. They went back down to the car, and he worked from the passenger seat in the parking lot outside Mrs. Calloway's building, the city quiet around them at this hour. Lena sat in the driver's seat and read the tablet and didn't ask questions he hadn't answered yet, which he'd come to recognize as one of her more useful qualities. She knew when to talk and when to be present without talking, which was rarer than people acknowledged. The secondary spike he'd deprioritized 2 weeks ago resolved, with a different interpretive lens, to a transaction routing number attached to a property management company on the northwest side of Chicago. He dug into the company's registered assets, 3 of them active, 2 dormant, one that had been registered as a marine facility before going into administrative limbo 4 years ago. He looked at the address. Calumet River, he said. Old freight distribution yard. Been in administrative holding since the original company folded. You think that's it? I think Cole needed a location nobody would look at. A property held by a dormant company, no active permits, no regular traffic, close enough to downtown to be accessible, isolated enough to manage a handoff. He was already typing the address into his phone to send to Rice, and it's on the water, which gives a buyer the option of arriving by boat. No road surveillance. He sent it to Rice. Her response came in 2 minutes. Cole just changed direction. Heading south. You might have something. Team is redirecting. Ethan, I mean it. Do not go to that location. He put the phone in his jacket pocket. She said, don't go, Lena said. I heard her. Lena was quiet. Then, how far is Calumet River from here? 22 minutes. Another pause. Shorter. Drive or navigate, she said. He drove. He didn't have a plan in the formal sense, which was something his training had always complicated. The SEAL model was deliberate, rehearsed, with contingencies mapped before boots hit the ground. What he had instead was an understanding of the terrain based on satellite imagery and the building's registered permits, a knowledge of Cole's psychology based on 2 weeks of watching him, and the specific focused clarity that came to him in high-stress situations, like a frequency he could tune to when everything else went quiet. He also had Lena in the passenger seat, which was not a tactical asset he'd planned for and which he was choosing not to think about too carefully right now. Cole will have at least 2 people with him, he said, keeping his eyes on the road. Personal security he's been running outside the company's official team. The surveillance footage from the last week shows a recurring face that doesn't belong to anyone on our authorized security roster. How many, realistically? 2 personal security minimum. The buyer's people will be separate. They'll arrive at the location with their own team. If the handoff is anything like the operational profile I've been building, the buyer sends 2 to 3 people for the physical exchange and keeps the principal off-site until the product is confirmed. So we're looking at 4 to 6 people at minimum. At minimum, plus Cole. She didn't say anything for a moment. And Rice's team is behind us. Behind us, yes. How far behind, I don't know. He glanced at her briefly. When we get there, you stay in the car until… No. Lena, you said that at the fabrication building, and I didn't stay in the car, and you found Noah 14 minutes before the federal team arrived. Her voice was level, but had something underneath it that wasn't going to move. I'm not an operator, I know that, but I'm not useless, and I'm not going to sit in a car while you walk into a freight yard alone. He kept his eyes on the road. He wanted to argue with her. The argument he wanted to make was operationally sound, and she knew it was operationally sound, and it didn't matter, because the look on her face in the side mirror told him he'd lose the argument and spend time losing it that he didn't have. Stay behind me, he said. Don't move unless I tell you. If shooting starts, you get low, and you get behind something solid, and you do not stand up until I tell you it's clear. Understood. I need a verbal confirmation that you understand those specific instructions. I understand those specific instructions, she said, with a precision that made clear she knew exactly why he was asking and was choosing to comply rather than resist. All of them. So, the freight yard sat at the end of a dead-access road off the industrial corridor near the Calumet River, the kind of location that had been useful once and then become invisible, swallowed by the city's indifference to its own abandoned infrastructure. Ethan killed the headlights a quarter-mile out and parked behind a rusted equipment shed at the edge of the property's perimeter fence. The building was a converted warehouse, 2 stories, with a loading bay that opened toward the river. Through the gaps in the perimeter fence, he could see 2 vehicles parked in the interior lot, different plates from the ones he'd seen on surveillance, which meant Cole's people had switched transport. A light was on in the loading bay. Figures moved inside, partially visible through the dock doors. He counted what he could. 3 exterior, possibly more inside. A 4th vehicle he hadn't initially seen parked in the shadow of the building's east wall. Larger, a cargo van, which suggested the buyer's people had arrived separately. He turned to Lena. In the dark of the car, her face was very still. Stay 20 yards back and use the equipment shed as cover, he said quietly. You have your phone? Yes? Rice is already receiving my location. If you lose contact with me for more than 5 minutes, you call her directly and you tell her everything you can see. He held her gaze. 5 minutes, not 3, not 2. 5. 5, she said. And if something comes at you from a direction I'm not covering, you run. Not toward the building, not toward me. You run perpendicular to the property line and you keep running. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read in the dark. You're going to be fine, she said. It wasn't quite a question and wasn't quite a statement. Probably, he said, which was honest. He got out of the car. The 2 exterior guards on the south side were positioned at the corners of the building, which was a reasonable configuration for watching approaches from the road, but created a blind interval between them at the building's midpoint. Ethan moved through it in under 45 seconds, low and close to the wall, and came up beside the dock entrance. Inside the loading bay, Cole, standing near a heavy wooden table, in a posture that signaled both authority and the particular tension of a man who has been recently scared and is overcompensating. Beside him, one of the 2 men from the recurring surveillance footage, thick, gray-jacketed, hands visible, watching the room. On the other side of the table, 2 men Ethan didn't recognize, both in the careful, anonymous presentation of professional intermediaries. Between them on the table, a small hard case, the kind used for sensitive equipment transport. The cash-in drive. It was already out, which meant the transaction was closer to completion than he'd hoped. He needed inside the bay before the case closed. The service door on the building's east wall was unlocked, which was either carelessness or a mistake someone was going to regret. He slipped through it and into the building's interior, a back corridor running parallel to the main loading space, separated from it by a plywood partition with a window cut for dock oversight that had been covered on the loading bay side but not on his. He could see Cole clearly through the gap in the covering, a 3-inch strip of visibility, enough. He could also see that Cole's remaining security man was positioned between Cole and the service door, which was the correct placement and which meant Ethan couldn't get to the table without coming through him first. I was still working through options when the loading bay door from the riverside opened and two more men entered, and behind them, waterlogged and wrong by every measure of the situation, came a face Ethan hadn't seen since the documentation he'd pulled 2 weeks ago. Yolanda Pratt, the contract data analyst, who apparently wasn't just a facilitator, but was running the ground operation for the buyer's side. Which meant Stokes, the other name on his list, was probably managing the digital transfer verification. The room now had 7 people in it, not counting whoever Rice's team was about to introduce. Cole picked up the hard case from the table and turned it toward Pratt. Verification first, then transfer. Pratt took the case and handed it to one of the men behind her, who opened a laptop. The verification process, authentication against the buyer's specifications, would take 4 to 7 minutes based on what Ethan knew about the file architecture. 4 to 7 minutes. Reese's team was somewhere behind him. 5 minutes, he'd told Lena. He'd been inside too. He moved along the corridor toward the loading bay's interior access point, staying below the partition sill. He was 3 steps from the door when it opened from the other side, and Cole's gray-jacketed security man stepped through, not because he'd detected Ethan, but because he was repositioning, checking the corridor on a standard rotation. Ethan had about a second. He used it. The man went down quietly, which was the important part. Ethan caught him, controlled the descent, left him propped against the corridor wall in a way that would read as standing from a distance and wouldn't read as anything at all from inside the loading bay. I took the man's radio and the small backup weapon from his ankle holster. He went through the door. Cole was still facing Pratt and the verification laptop. He didn't turn when the door opened. He'd been hearing his security man move in and out for hours, and the pattern had become background. It took him 3 full seconds to register that the person who came through the door wasn't his security man. In those 3 seconds, Ethan crossed half the distance to the table. When Cole turned, the recognition moved through his face in a sequence: confusion, then identification, then fear, then the particular calculus of a man deciding whether to fight or run, performed in about half a second and resolved incorrectly. Mercer, Cole said. The name came out flat and surprised, the way names do when someone isn't actually certain the person in front of them is real. Harrison, Ethan said. He used the first name the way Lena had once used his, deliberately, to see what it did. What it did was pull something defensive across Cole's face. You don't know what you're interrupting. I have a pretty good idea. Pratt had turned. The 2 men behind her had positioned differently, reactive, not yet committed. The buyer's men near the door were watching Ethan with the professional attention of people trying to decide what category he belonged to. He's alone, Pratt said, to the room rather than to Ethan, the words working as instruction as much as observation. He's not a problem, Cole said, and Ethan recognized the bravado of it, the way Cole's voice had gone up slightly in authority to compensate for the fear that had just moved through his eyes. He's a consultant who overstepped his access. He looked at Ethan directly. You have no legal authority here. You're not law enforcement. You're going to turn around and walk out that door, and in about 4 hours this will all be finished, and none of it will have anything to do with you. The FBI team outside might complicate that timeline, Ethan said. The room went quiet in a particular way. You're bluffing, Pratt said. Cortland Fabrications, Ethan said. 4 in custody. 2 picked up on foot. We've had surveillance on Cole since this morning. The Meridian Bridge relay is documented. The Luxembourg shell is documented. He looked at Cole. The only question right now is whether you make this harder than it needs to be. Cole's jaw moved. Something happened behind his eyes, a rapid internal accounting, the look of a man running numbers and not liking the results. He looked at Pratt. Pratt looked at the 2 men behind her, and the communication that passed between them was not verbal. The next 30 seconds were not clean. One of Pratt's men moved first, toward Ethan's left, which was predictable. When people move on a single target in a confined space, they flank, because it's what their instincts tell them to do, and because it sometimes works. Ethan stepped into the movement rather than away from it, which disrupted the angle, and the sequence of the next few moments was fast and contained and resulted in 2 people on the floor and a third reconsidering his position near the door. Cole had moved during this, not toward the exit, which surprised Ethan, but toward the table, where the laptop and the open case still sat. He grabbed the case with one hand and with the other produced a gun that he hadn't been visibly carrying, which meant a shoulder holster under the jacket, which Ethan had noted as a possibility and which he was now dealing with as a reality. The gun was pointed at Lena, who was standing in the loading bay door, which was not where Ethan had told her to be. The room stopped. Ethan stopped. Cole's hand was not entirely steady, which was information, but the distance between the barrel and Lena was not large enough for unsteady to mean safe. He held the case in his other hand and looked at Ethan with the expression of a man who has found the one piece of leverage he believes he still has. "The drive leaves with me," Cole said, "or she doesn't leave at all." The silence lasted about 4 seconds. 4 seconds is not very long. But in a room where nobody is moving and a gun is pointed at a person and every variable is trying to resolve simultaneously, 4 seconds is its own kind of eternity. Ethan looked at Lena. She looked back at him. Her face was controlled in a way that cost her something. He could see the cost, the very slight tension around her eyes and jaw that she was managing rather than showing. She was frightened. She was also very clearly thinking. Her eyes moved, very slightly, down and to the left. He'd worked with enough people in high-stress situations to recognize the difference between random eye movement and directed eye movement. He didn't follow her gaze immediately. That would tip it. He kept his focus on Cole and let his peripheral vision do the work, which was something he was good at. A metal pipe. On the floor to Cole's left, partially behind a loading pallet. Old, heavy, the kind of debris that accumulated in buildings that had been vacant for years. She'd seen it when she came through the door. She'd been standing there long enough to map the room, which was what she'd been doing when Cole had found her with the gun. He looked back at Cole. "Put the gun down," Ethan said. "You're not going to use it. You don't know what You've spent 12 years building a reputation as a legitimate executive," Ethan said. "Defense technology theft has a federal sentencing range. Homicide changes the calculus in a direction you don't come back from. You know that." He kept his voice very level. "Put it down." "The drive leaves with me," Cole said again, less steadily. "It doesn't." Cole's focus sharpened on Ethan, the way a person's focus sharpens when they're trying to project conviction they're not entirely sure they have. In that focus, his peripheral attention on Lena narrowed by a fraction. It was enough. She moved. Not a lunge. She didn't have the angle for a lunge, but a sharp pivot and drop, reaching for the pipe with both hands, coming up from below the barrel's line. The gun discharged. The sound was enormous in the enclosed space, and the shot went into the floor 3 feet from where she'd been standing because she was no longer there. The pipe connected with Cole's gun hand at the wrist. The gun went sideways. Ethan was already moving. Cole was bigger than he looked with a jacket on, and scared men hit harder than calm ones, and the next 30 seconds were unglamorous and physically costly in the way that real confrontations always were. Not the clean economy of the fabrication building, but something messier, more desperate. A man fighting with the particular ferocity of someone who understands that what he's losing is not a battle, but a life's architecture. Ethan had been in worse. He'd been in much worse. He put Cole on the ground and kept him there. From the floor, Cole looked up at him with something that wasn't quite defeat and wasn't quite defiance. It was the look of a man processing the gap between who he'd believed himself to be and what the last 12 minutes had revealed. It was, Ethan thought, a surprisingly human look for a man who had done inhuman things. "It was never personal," Cole said. He seemed to need to say it. "I know," Ethan said. "That's not the part that matters." He heard Rice's team come through the riverside doors. The specific sound of federal agents entering a space, organized, certain, with the authority of warrants and backup, and everything that official action looked like. The buyer's remaining men were cooperating immediately, which was the rational choice and which Ethan had predicted. Pratt was already on the floor with her hands behind her head, having made a faster calculation than Cole. He stood up. Lena was still holding the pipe. She looked at it, then set it down on the pallet beside her with a deliberateness that suggested she was managing something physical. Her hands, her breathing, the aftermath of adrenaline moving through a body that wasn't trained to metabolize it the way his was. She wasn't shaking, but she was close. He crossed the room to her. "You were supposed to stay at the equipment shed," he said. "I saw light through the dock window. I saw Cole pull the gun." She looked up at him. Her voice was steady but took effort to be. "I wasn't going to stand outside while—" "I know," he said. He said it the same way he'd said it to Cole, but it meant something entirely different. He looked at her for a moment. at her face specifically, which was the face of someone who has just done something they didn't know they had in them and is still deciding what to think about that. "You did good." "The pipe was just there," she said. "Things are sometimes just there," he said. "The question is whether you see them." She looked at him with something complicated moving behind her eyes, something that had been building across the last several weeks, in the way that things build when you're too busy surviving immediate crises to notice them accumulating. She opened her mouth and then didn't say whatever she'd been going to say, because Rice arrived at their side with the specific energy of someone who has a great deal of paperwork ahead of her and mixed feelings about the unauthorized people currently standing in her crime scene. "Both of you," Rice said, "are going to give me a very long statement." "I know," "No," Lena said. "The drive is on the table," Ethan said. "Unopened. The verification process was interrupted before completion." Rice looked at the table, at the laptop, at the hard case sitting where Cole had dropped it. The Cassian specifications. All of it, intact. Rice exhaled. Not relief exactly, but the sound of a very large problem resolving into a different, more manageable shape. She looked at Ethan. "I told you not to come here." "You did. And here you are." "Here I am." She looked at him for a moment, then at Lena, then back at him. "Cole?" "Alive. Wrist may be broken. He needs medical." "Of course he does." She turned toward her team and raised her voice. "I need medical at the primary position. And somebody get me a chain of custody bag for the equipment on the table. Nobody touches the laptop or the case until I have gloves on it." She walked away into the organized noise of a federal scene taking shape. The loading bay filled with people and procedure and the particular exhausted momentum of an operation reaching its conclusion. Ethan stood in the middle of it and let the noise happen around him and felt, for the first time in several weeks, something he didn't immediately have a name for. Not relief. Relief was too simple. Something that had more weight, more texture. The particular feeling of a thing being over that you weren't certain you'd survive long enough to see end. Lena stood beside him. Not touching, but close enough that he was aware of the proximity in a way that had nothing to do with operational awareness. "Noah's going to want to know what happened," she said. "Yeah." "What are you going to tell him?" He thought about it. About an 8-year-old boy with a torn piece of insole in his fist, leaving arrows on a floor in the dark. "The truth," he said. "Simplified." "How simplified?" "The bad people lost and everyone went home." He paused. "He'll ask about the details for the next 6 months. I'll give him one at a time." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. In the noise and the light of the freight yard and the organized chaos of federal agents doing their work, it was a small and specific sound, and he heard it clearly. Outside, somewhere across the Calumet River, the city continued its ordinary night. The freight and the traffic and the 10,000 simultaneous lives that didn't know anything had happened here and wouldn't notice anything different in the morning. That was the nature of the work, in the end. The city never knew what it had been protected from. It just kept going, the way cities do, indifferent and alive and absolutely dependent on people who were willing to stand in dark buildings and make hard calls. Ethan looked at the river through the open dock doors. The water was dark and moved with a slow, indifferent purpose. He thought about Noah asleep under a quilt in Mrs. Calloway's apartment, still holding his insole. He thought about the 8 years since Claire and the life he'd built in the negative space of loss, and the way the shape of a life can change without your permission, or sometimes with it. He didn't think about the future in any organized way. He wasn't built for organized optimism. But something had shifted in him tonight, in the loading bay, watching a woman he hadn't trusted, and then had trusted and then had watched pick up a pipe on pure instinct and use it correctly. Something had shifted, and he was honest enough with himself to know it, even if he wasn't ready to name it. The federal agents moved around them both, purposeful and efficient. Harrison Cole was lifted from the floor, hands cuffed, wrist braced. He didn't look at Ethan as they walked him past. He looked straight ahead with the careful dignity of a man who had lost everything and was choosing, in this last public moment, not to let anyone see the full size of it. Ethan watched him go. Then he turned away from the dock doors and the river and the retreating figure of a man who had made different choices, and he looked at Lena, who was already looking at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment that lasted a little longer than strictly necessary. "Let's go get your statement done," he said. "Let's," she said. They walked out of the building together into the cold night air, and the door swung shut behind them, and the river moved on without them. The federal statements took 4 hours. They sat in separate rooms at the Chicago field office. Standard procedure, Rice explained, not accusation. And Ethan gave his account in the sequential, precise way he gave all accounts. And somewhere across the building, Lena gave hers. And by 2 a.m., the paperwork had reached a size that suggested the legal aftermath would outlast all of them by several years. Harrison Cole had been processed and transferred. Yolanda Pratt had retained counsel within 40 minutes of arrest, which Rice noted was faster than most people managed and suggested prior planning. Stokes, the engineering compliance head, had been picked up at his home in Evanston at 11 p.m., still in his pajamas, and had immediately begun cooperating in the particular exhausted way of someone who had been waiting, at some level, to be caught. The cash-in drive was in federal custody. The buyer's intermediaries were being held pending international coordination. The Eastern European procurement front that Ethan had traced through the Luxembourg shell was now the subject of a separate investigation involving 3 additional agencies whose names Rice mentioned once and didn't repeat. Cole had said nothing since his arrest. His lawyer had arrived by midnight and the silence had become official. Ethan drove to Mrs. Calloway's apartment at 2:30 a.m. and let himself in with the spare key she'd pressed into his hand months ago, the first time Noah had gotten sick on a school day and Ethan had needed someone to stay. Noah was still on the couch, the quilt pulled up to his chin, the piece of insole finally released from his hand and sitting on the coffee table where it had apparently fallen. Ethan stood in the dark living room and looked at his son for a while, the way parents do when their children are asleep, and the fear of the last several hours has nowhere left to go except into that particular long, quiet look. He was not someone who cried easily. He hadn't cried since Claire's funeral, and even then it had come out sideways. Not at the service, but 3 weeks later, alone in the car in a parking garage, suddenly and without warning, the way grief does when you've been holding it back long enough that it stops asking permission. He didn't cry now either. But it was a near thing, and he knew it was a near thing, and he sat down in the armchair across from the couch and watched Noah breathe for about 10 minutes before he trusted himself to move again. In the morning, Noah woke up and immediately said, "Did you get the bad guys?" "The FBI got the bad guys," Ethan said. "I helped." "Did Lena help?" He looked at his son. "Yeah, she did." Noah considered this with the seriousness of someone processing information that might require revision of an existing opinion. "She's okay," he said finally, which from Noah was a meaningful concession, given that his baseline assessment of most adults was a kind of watchful neutrality. "She is," Ethan said. "Is she your friend?" Ethan poured coffee and did not answer immediately, which was itself a kind of answer, and Noah, who was 8 but not in any way unintelligent, moved on to asking about breakfast, which was the correct thing to do. The weeks after the arrest had a strange quality. The particular anticlimax of aftermath, where the tension that has been sustaining everything drains away, and what's left is the ordinary work of consequence. Ethan gave 3 additional depositions. He appeared before a DoD security panel to explain the nature of his access and his findings, a meeting that lasted 6 hours, and during which 2 of the panel members clearly recognized the classification architecture of his service record and asked questions they phrased carefully to avoid acknowledging what they already understood about who they were talking to. He answered what he was asked and volunteered nothing additional, which had always been his preference. Lena spent most of those weeks in the legal and regulatory machinery that Rice had warned her about: congressional notification, DoD review, 2 separate federal audits of the company's security infrastructure. She handled it with the same quality he'd seen in her across the preceding month. No performance, no deflection, just the hard work of sitting in difficult rooms and giving honest accounts of what had happened and what she was doing to ensure it didn't happen again. She fired 2 additional people in the executive layer whose access patterns, under renewed scrutiny, showed irregularities she hadn't caught the first time. She restructured the entire security oversight framework and brought in an outside firm to audit the restructuring. She told Ethan about these things in the same way she'd told him about Cole, directly, without seeking reassurance, but also without the pretense that none of it cost her anything. He noticed that she'd stopped performing normalcy around him sometime around the night at the fabrication building, and had never picked it back up. He wasn't sure she was aware of it. He thought probably she wasn't. His consulting contract had technically ended with Cole's arrest. Lena extended it without discussing it first, simply sent a revised agreement through Petra, which he read and didn't immediately sign and didn't immediately refuse. He left it on his kitchen counter and walked past it for 4 days. On the 4th day, she called him. "You're not going to sign it," she said. "I'm thinking." "You've been thinking for 4 days. That's longer than it took you to decide to take the first one." The first one had a clearer problem statement. A pause. "And this one doesn't?" He moved the agreement to the edge of the counter, then moved it back. "This one feels like a different thing than it's being presented as." She was quiet for a moment. "What is it being presented as?" "An extension of an existing professional arrangement." "And what do you think it is?" He looked out his kitchen window at the Wicker Park street below, at the ordinary Tuesday morning traffic of people moving between ordinary things. "I think it's you trying to find a reason for us to keep being in the same building." The silence on her end had a quality he'd learned to read. Not discomfort, more like someone deciding whether to say the true thing or the easier thing. "Yes," she said. "It is." He let that sit. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I want to be straight with you about that. I haven't been, since Claire, I haven't had any serious. I'm not saying I don't." He stopped, recognized he was handling this badly, started again. "I have a son who has already been through more disruption than an 8-year-old should deal with. That's not a reason to close every door, but it's a reason to move carefully." "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to move any particular speed. I'm asking you to not disappear." He thought about that, about the specific verb she'd chosen. Not stay or continue or any of the more obviously loaded options. Disappear. The things she knew he was capable of, because she'd built her initial profile of him around the evidence of it. The decade-long gap in the paper trail, the deliberate anonymity of the life he'd constructed in Chicago. "I'm not going to disappear," he said. "Okay. But I'm also not signing a consulting contract as a proxy for a conversation we should probably just have at some point." "That's fair." A beat. "Do you want to have it over dinner?" He looked at the unsigned agreement on the counter. "Noah will want to come." "I assumed he would." "He'll interrogate you about anglerfish." "I've been doing some reading," she said, and he heard something in her voice that was absolutely not what she sounded like in boardrooms or federal offices. Something lighter, slightly self-conscious, a register he associated with people who were trying something new and weren't entirely sure of the footing. "I know that the anglerfish's light-producing organ is called a photophore, and that the male of the species is significantly smaller than the female." He was quiet for a moment. "You researched anglerfish." "I wanted to be prepared." He stood in his kitchen with the phone to his ear and felt something move through him that he didn't try to stop or qualify. It wasn't dramatic. It was small and specific and real. The feeling of a door opening in a house you'd mostly closed up, letting in air you'd forgotten, could be this ordinary and this good. "Thursday," he said. "There's a place on Milwaukee Avenue. Noah likes the pasta." "Thursday," she said. The dinner was not smooth. Nothing involving a 9-year-old ever was. Noah had recently advanced from 8, with a birthday that Ethan had managed to make happen despite everything, including a cake that had leaned at an angle Noah described as structurally concerning, but had eaten enthusiastically anyway. He arrived at the restaurant with opinions about the menu and questions about Lena's job that he delivered with the investigative persistence of someone who had recently learned that adults often knew more than they admitted. "Do you actually understand how the technology works?" Noah asked her. "Or do you just tell people what to build?" "Both," Lena said. "I understood how to build it a long time ago. Now I mostly tell people what to build and ask hard questions about whether what they're building is what they said they'd build." Noah thought about this. "That sounds easier." "It's not. It's just a different kind of hard." "My dad says hard things are just things you haven't practiced enough yet." Lena looked at Ethan. He was eating pasta and declining to either confirm or deflect, which she had come to recognize as his version of letting a moment breathe. "Your dad's not wrong," she said to Noah. "He's usually not," Noah said, in the tone of someone making a reluctant but honest admission. "He was wrong about the science fair, though. He said second place was fine." "It is fine." Volcanoes, Noah said, with the flat finality of someone who had closed the case, are not science. Ethan made a sound into his pasta. Lena pressed her lips together. Noah, satisfied, returned to his food. Afterward, walking back to the car in the October cold, Noah walked between them in the unself-conscious way children occupy space. And at some point, not planned, not asked for, he put one hand in Ethan's and, after a moment's consideration that only Lena noticed, put his other hand in hers. He was looking at the street, at a dog someone was walking, at the ordinary, interesting things a city offers a 9-year-old on a Thursday night. Lena looked at that small hand in hers. She thought about the night she'd stood in a corridor outside a federal conference room and asked Rice quietly whether the boy was going to be okay. Rice had said probably yes, physically. Lena had meant something more than physically, and she thought Rice had known that but answered the question she was authorized to answer. She thought about the version of herself from 2 months ago, who had sat in a restaurant and watched a cook dismantle 6 men and had responded by pulling out her phone to investigate him. That woman had been competent and capable and fundamentally alone in the particular way that very successful, very defended people are alone. Not from lack of company, but from the habit of keeping the important parts at a slight remove, safe from the kind of loss that comes when you let something matter. She thought about a pipe on a loading bay floor and the split second in which she'd stopped calculating and just moved. She tightened her hand slightly around Noah's. He didn't notice or noticed and didn't comment, which with Noah amounted to the same thing. Ethan launched the consulting company 6 weeks later. He'd been resistant to the form of it, the name, the website, the professional packaging of capabilities he'd always treated as private. And it took Lena 3 separate conversations and 1 mildly heated argument in her office to get him to understand that the resistance was reasonable, but the thing it was protecting against had already changed. "You've been treating competence like a secret," she said, in the 3rd conversation, which was the heated one. "Like if you make it official, something gets taken away." "That's not what I'm doing." "Then what are you doing?" He was quiet for longer than felt comfortable. "When I came to Chicago," he said, "I wanted to be invisible. I wanted a life that didn't require explaining. Noah was 4. I'd just buried his mother, and I'd already buried a version of myself that I wasn't sure I wanted to resurrect." He looked at the window. "The kitchen it was honest. There was something honest about it. You showed up, you did the work, you went home. And now? Now I'm not trying to be invisible. That ship has fairly definitively sailed." Something moved through his face, not quite humor, but adjacent to it. "Apparently I'm in the news." He was, briefly. A federal case of this scale generated coverage, and his name had appeared in 2 national outlets, despite Rice's best efforts to keep the operational details classified. He'd declined every interview request with a consistency that the journalists had eventually accepted and that had produced, somewhat paradoxically, a higher degree of public interest than engagement would have. Lena invested in the company at a level that made it viable without making him dependent, a distinction she'd understood mattered to him without being told. The company's first 3 clients came through relationships she'd quietly activated, corporate security assessments for firms in her network who needed exactly the kind of work Ethan did, which was thorough, honest, and not interested in telling clients what they wanted to hear. He hired 2 people in the first month, a former Army intelligence analyst he'd known years ago, and a young cybersecurity specialist Lena's team had identified who turned out to be exactly as good as her resume suggested, and approximately twice as difficult as anyone had anticipated, which Ethan considered a feature rather than a problem. He worked from an office in River North, 12 minutes from Noah's school. He was present for every pickup. He coached Noah's weekend soccer team with the particular mixture of patience and absolute refusal to accept poor effort that the kids had initially resented and eventually relied on. Noah played midfield, badly but with commitment, which Ethan told him was more important than natural ability, and which Noah received with the characteristic skepticism of a child who has heard this said by adults who happen to be good at things. Lena came to the 3rd game. She hadn't been invited exactly. Ethan had mentioned it in passing, which she'd understood as the closest he got to an invitation, and she'd shown up with coffee for him and a juice box for Noah, and Noah had looked at the juice box and then at her and said, "I'm 9, but had taken it anyway." After the game, walking to the parking lot, Noah said, "Lena, do you like soccer?" "Honestly, not especially. He looked at her with what might have been respect. Me neither, he said. But I'm pretty good at it. Ethan, who was carrying Noah's bag and had been listening to this exchange, said, You are not pretty good at it. I'm getting there, Noah said, which was fair, and which none of them disputed. It wasn't a simple thing, building the life they were building. Anyone who tells a story like this and makes it sound simple is leaving out the texture of it. The mornings when Noah woke up asking for his mother with the particular disorientation of a half-asleep child, and Ethan had to hold that and not break under it. The evenings when Lena came from a 14-hour day and sat across from Ethan in his kitchen and felt the specific loneliness of a person who had spent years making herself too busy to feel it, surfacing now that she was less busy. The arguments they had, not dramatic, not operationally high stakes, but the ordinary friction of two people with different default speeds and different defensive habits and very different ideas about what constituted a reasonable response to bureaucratic frustration. She moved fast and wanted decisions made. He moved deliberately and wanted to understand every angle before committing. She expressed displeasure directly and expected it to land and be processed immediately. He went quiet when he was processing something difficult, which she initially read as withdrawal and which required 2 direct conversations and 1 genuine apology from her before she recalibrated. He was not easy to know. She wasn't either, and she was honest enough with herself to hold both truths at once. They were not people who had arrived at each other smoothly. They'd arrived through a restaurant ambush and a corporate conspiracy and a freight yard in the dark, and a small boy's insole left as breadcrumbs in the dark, which was not a conventional origin story, but was entirely theirs. The proposal happened at a picnic. This was Noah's idea, which became apparent afterward. He had campaigned for a picnic with a persistence that Ethan had attributed to a phase and Lena had attributed to the good weather, and which had actually been a carefully maintained cover story for the fact that Noah had, at some point in the preceding month, asked Ethan whether he was going to marry Lena, and Ethan had said he was thinking about it, and Noah had said, with the directness of someone who had been waiting for the adults to catch up, "Stop thinking and do it." He'd also stolen the ring from Ethan's sock drawer, where it had been sitting for 3 weeks in a small velvet box with the impractical optimism of an object waiting to be used, and had wrapped it in a paper towel and put it in his jacket pocket, and had guarded it through the entire picnic with a seriousness that Ethan, who was highly trained in detecting surveillance, somehow failed to notice. They were sitting by the lake, Lena leaning back on her hands, Ethan beside her, Noah officially bored and unofficially operating. When Noah stood up and said, with the formality of someone who had rehearsed this, "Dad, I think you should say the thing now." Ethan looked at his son. Noah produced the ring from his jacket pocket in its paper towel wrapping and held it out. Ethan looked at the ring, then at Noah, then at Lena, who was looking at Noah with an expression that was trying to stay composed and losing the effort. "Did you plan this?" Ethan said to Noah. "Mostly," Noah said. "You were taking too long." Lena made a sound that was both a laugh and something more than a laugh. The sound of a person surprised by happiness, which is different from expected happiness, different in the way it arrives before you've built defenses against it. She pressed her hand over her mouth for a second and then didn't. Ethan took the ring from Noah's paper towel. He looked at Lena and did not make a speech. He was not a man who made speeches, and she did not want one from him, and they both knew that, which was its own kind of intimacy. "I'm not easy," he said. "I know. And I come with—" He gestured at Noah, who was watching this with the focused interest of someone who had invested significantly in the outcome. "I know that too," she said. "Okay," he said, and then, "Will you?" She looked at him, at the scar on his jaw and the steadiness in his eyes, and the paper towel still in his other hand because he'd taken the ring but forgotten to put the towel down. She looked at Noah, who was 9 years old and had stolen a ring from a sock drawer and wrapped it in a paper towel, and waited through an entire picnic for the right moment, because he'd decided at some point in the preceding months that this was what he wanted his family to look like. She thought about what family actually was, at its core. Not the inherited version, not the one that arrives pre-assembled, but the chosen one. The one you build out of the specific people who showed up in your specific life and stayed. The one that requires the daily decision to show up, to not disappear, to be present for the ordinary and the extraordinary both. The one that isn't perfect and doesn't need to be. Yes, she said. Noah said, finally, and sat back down on the picnic blanket with the satisfaction of a project completed. They married in November at a small ceremony on the lakeshore with 23 people in attendance, which was everyone who mattered and no one who didn't. Rice came, which surprised Ethan and which Lena had quietly arranged. Mrs. Calloway came and cried with a thoroughness that she seemed to consider appropriate and that Noah regarded with the sympathetic bafflement of someone who understood emotion in theory. Petra came and kept checking her phone, which was her version of relaxing. Noah stood beside Ethan through the ceremony with his hands clasped in front of him in the posture he used when he was taking something seriously, which he did not apply universally but applied here, completely. There was no moment of cinematic perfection. The wind came off the lake and blew the officiant's papers sideways at a critical juncture. Ethan fumbled slightly with the ring, which was the most visibly nervous she had ever seen him. Lena's voice caught once, briefly, and she cleared her throat and kept going. Noah whispered something to Ethan at one point that made Ethan press his lips together very hard, and afterward when she asked what it was, Noah said, "I told him not to mess up the ring part," which explained the expression. They drove home through the November city, the three of them, through the ordinary traffic of a Saturday evening, through the neighborhoods and the lights and the 10,000 simultaneous lives of a city that didn't know anything in particular had happened. Noah fell asleep in the back seat before they cleared downtown, with the easy confidence of a child who knows exactly where he's going and who's driving. Ethan and Lena drove in the comfortable silence of people who have run out of things to perform for each other and found that what remains is enough. Better than enough. The specific kind of enough that some people search for their whole lives, and some people build from the wreckage of the lives they'd planned, with the people they didn't expect, in the city they'd chosen to start over in. She looked at the city moving past the window. He kept his eyes on the road. After a while, without looking at her, he reached across and put his hand over hers where it rested on the console. She turned her hand over. They drove on through the dark, the three of them, through the city and into the ordinary, extraordinary life they had chosen, and were choosing still, and would keep choosing, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. And it was theirs. And they had all decided, each in their own way and their own time, that real and ours was more than enough to build a life from. Some people are born into their families. Some people earn them the hard way, through fire and freight yards, and the particular grace of showing up when showing up costs something. The Mercers had done it the second way, and they would spend the rest of their lives, in all the ordinary mornings and difficult evenings and unremarkable dinners that make up a life, being grateful that they had.